Good evening and welcome to the MyCP webinar series. My name is Paul Gross and I'm going to be your host this evening. The MyCP webinar series is intended to bring to the community discussions with the researchers conducting research within our network so that community members can ask questions, learn more about the research, and give their input. Tonight, I'm very excited to have a presentation on the results from our sensory study for people with CP. Presented by Dr. Drs Aravamuthan and Dr. Danielle Barber. So the agenda for this evening will be our typical agenda. I'm going to give a brief overview about the CP Research Network, and then we'll dive into the presentation of the CP sensory study. And then we'll have an open Q&A with Drs Aravamuthan and Barber. So the CP Research Network's mission is to optimize the lifelong health and wellness of people with cerebral palsy and their families through high-quality research, education, and community programs. To give you an idea of what we've done since our founding in 2015, the first thing we did was we launched the CP Toolkit from Diagnosis to Understanding in 2015, which we've served up more than 5,100 copies through hospitals and online through our website. We went on to develop a well-being guide for caregivers and parents and translated the CP Toolkit into Spanish and Portuguese in 2017. And then in 2020, we launched MyCP, which is a web portal that provides personalized information to people with CP. On the research front, we launched our clinical registry, i.e. a database of people that come into the clinic for treatment for CP. We launched that in March of 2016, and it now has more than 7,500 patients in it. And then we went on to launch a community registry so that we could gather information about people's lived experience that was outside of the clinic. We launched that in March of 2019, and it now has over 1,600 patients in it. We've been patient-centered since our founding, and one of the first things we did was we put on a patient-centered research agenda planning process called Research CP, where we brought over 200 people together online and eventually 45 people together in Chicago, and then went on to publish a 16-theme research agenda that was prioritized by the community and published in 2018 that really guides our work. We've gone on to get significant funding milestones for our work, public funding from NIH for our work in genetics, and more recently, we partnered with the largest private funder of CP research, the CP Alliance Research Foundation, or CPARF. We also have 4 quality improvement initiatives running across the network. Quality improvement is another way to improve outcomes in care. It's a little different than research, but has many of the same effects of improving outcomes. We are also focused academically in sharing our work and translating the knowledge of our work. We've had 8 publications. Our 9th will come out this Friday in the Journal of Neurosurgery Pediatrics on intrathecal baclofen pump infection reduction. We've had over 27 academic presentations, and we've got 5 more manuscripts being written right now. And then on the wellness front, we've really focused our efforts on our partnership with the National Center for Health, Physical Activity, and Disability by providing the mentor program to the CP community. That's mindfulness, exercise, nutrition to optimize resilience, which is really a program that receives rave reviews, and I'd recommend it to any of the adults that are watching the webinar this evening. So the CP Research Network is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we really bring together hospitals, clinicians, therapists, researchers, and the community members, patient advocates, to conduct research to improve outcomes for people with CP. Physically, we have a data coordinating center, the place where those registries come together at the University of Pittsburgh, at their epidemiology data center. And then we have our then we have our education and well-being programs, or to round out what we do. An important part of our education program and our engagement program is MyCP, which is this free personalized web portal inside of the CP Research Network that brings together the extended community. It allows community members to participate in research that's in the Community Registry through surveys. It provides a private forum for discussions about research and priorities and lived experience, with access to clinicians to provide information about the evidence for treatments. And it provides personalized web resources to make it easier to navigate the wealth of information on our website. And then, of course, access to our free wellness programs. So anyone can sign up at mycp.org. So I want to talk a little bit about the registries, which play a significant role in our research. What you're looking at here are 4 graphs. The top 2 graphs are from our clinical registry, again, where data is collected based on people coming into the hospital. And on the left side, you have gross motor function classification system, or GMFCS, which is a 5-level rating about how people move in the community. Do they walk, do they ambulate independently, or do they use a wheelchair or a walker to get around? That's described in those 5 levels. And you see the distribution of the more than 5,000 people we had in the registry as of November 21, when this graph was produced. On the right side, you see the distribution of age based on some bars, and you can quickly discern that over 20% of the people in our registry are adults. On the bottom, you have the same 2 data points, but graphed from our community registry, which currently, as of this week, has 1,669 patients in it. You see a very different distribution of GMFCS, and that's because the people we reach online in the community are not the same representation of people that go into the hospital for care. And then on the right-hand side, you see the age distribution, and you see it leans much more heavily into adults. So we get many more people online weighing into our registry than we get, say, parents of young children. So those are the 4 programs that make up our CP Research Network. Community engagement, here you have a photo of the 45 people that gathered in Chicago to work out our Research CP patient-centered research agenda. Our investigators gathering in Michigan in 2019 for our annual investigator meeting. And in the bottom left, you have our educational programs, and on the right, you have representation of our health and well-being programs. So the network is spread across North America. The green pins represent sites that are collecting data into the registry. Yellow pins are sites working on preparing the technology of the registry. The red pin is a site working on their regulatory compliance. And blue pins represent candidate sites, sites that have raised their hand and said, we want to join the network, but they haven't begun the process quite yet. So that's more than 30 centers in a learning health network to improve care for cerebral palsy. So a lot of what we do is try to accelerate research and quality improvement. This is our funnel that is quite full, as you can see. On the left, you see the concept area where we have teams work together with members of the community to generate research questions or concepts that need to move forward. They get reviewed. They try to reach grants and get funding, and then they go on to get implementation. And then you see the orange ovals are our quality improvement efforts, and the blue ovals are our research questions. And then after we generate the evidence, we write a manuscript, which we seek to get publicized. And then we try to take that evidence and roll it back into clinical practice. So we have a platform for continuous improvement. You see the sensory bubble there is moving we hope to move it from the manuscript phase into publication sometime soon. And it's encircled in dark green there to say that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm excited to turn this over to our 2 speakers, Dr. Drs Aravamuthan, who's an assistant professor of neurology in the Division of Child Neurology and Movement Disorders at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the principal investigator of our dystonia study group and the principal investigator of our dystonia diagnosis quality improvement effort, as well as the co-PI of this CP sensory study. And then we also have Danielle Barber, who is an attending physician at the Division of Neurology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's a co-PI on this study, as well as a newly announced board member to Hope for HIE, which is another patient advocacy organization that partially helps people with a diagnosis of CP after HIE. Anyway, let me turn it over to them.
So we would love for this to be very interactive. This is all based on a survey that was sent through the registry that Paul just described so beautifully. And we hopefully a bunch of you folks on the call tonight have taken the survey and are curious to find out what were the results from it. And we would love for this to be interactive and engaging. So please don't hesitate to just unmute and interrupt and ask questions. We would love for it to be a conversation. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. Just some disclosures about where research funding, none relevant to the talk for today. So most of us have been told have been taught that cerebral palsy is a motor disorder, but we're here today to talk about some parts of cerebral palsy that are not about just the motor piece. So we're interested in the sensory part of cerebral palsy. And we know that for kind of traditionally in the literature, from a medical perspective, what the information that's known about people with cerebral palsy is mostly focused, and any information about sensation has mostly been focused on touch and how touch and tactile discrimination is related to motor function. That leaves a lot of questions open. So some of the questions that we were hoping to address in this study were thinking about other sensory modalities, right? Touch is just one of our 5 senses. What about vision, hearing, smell, taste, proprioception also? And then we want to think about each of those sensory modalities, both if they are in hypo functioning or hyper. So someone who has, for example, in the realm of touch, decreased sensation to touch or increased sensitivity to touch, things, tactile stimuli that really are bothersome if they're too intense. Or similarly, you can have hypo or hyper sensitivity in the other sensory modalities as well. We wanted to relate these sensory symptoms and find out is there a relationship between these sensory symptoms and functional measures. So Paul introduced the gross motor function classification scale, the GMFCS, which some folks might be familiar with, but there are other functional domains as well related to hand function and vision function and eating function. So looking at all of those functional scales. And then something that before Paul even joined the call, some of us were chatting about how do these change? How does sensation change across the lifespan in people with cerebral palsy? So with all of those questions, we wanted to start with what sensory concerns do people with CP have? And like I said, look at all of those sensory modalities. And again, this is kind of repeating what we just talked about. And then thinking about children versus adults, is there a difference? So for this first study, because there's actually so little in the literature that addresses these questions, we started with a very open-ended exploratory hypothesis generating study where, we're just trying to get a sense of what information can we collect to just give us a hint of where to start. So associations that we've found from this study will certainly carry forward and think about how to hone down and collect more and further information in future studies that can be designed in a more hypothesis-driven and prospective way. All right, so the opportunity to participate in this study was sent out through the MyCP registry. We received 180 responses, and of those we received 155 complete responses. So those are the responses that we're going to talk about today. Of the people who responded, there were 119 adults and 36 pediatrics, and those were up to 21 years old. And the age range of the responders ranged from 1 year old. So obviously the 1 year old did not fill out the study themselves, the survey themselves. There was an opportunity for caregivers to complete the study for a person with CP in their life. And the age range was from 1 year old to 76 years old, with a mean of age 38 plus or minus 21 is the standard deviation. We did collect information about levels of function as well. And so in order to, the first part of putting this study together was a lot of thinking about how would we ask questions about how people perceive sensory information. And the person who, one of our co-authors on the study, Dr. Ariel Lyons-Warren, who's not with us today, but we work closely together on this study. Her background is really in sensory processing and not in CP. And she thought a lot about what are the different possible scales that can be used to measure sensation. And this scale was originally developed in the autism community, and she felt for multiple reasons, including that it could be the same scale could be applied both to children and adults, felt that this was the best one for us to move forward with. So in this case, for this scale, the adult version of the questions had 107 questions, validated from ages 15 to 76. There were 6 sections about hypersensitivity and 5 about hyposensitivity. And those domains vary across all of the sensory modalities plus proprioception, the typical 5 that we think of, plus proprioception. The pediatric version was a little bit shorter, and it's validated from ages 1 to 14. And it had the same 6 hypersensitivity sections as the adult, but only 3 hyposensitivity sections. And that was in tactile, vision, and auditory. And that was partly because smell and taste are harder to assess for a caregiver to assess for a child in the hyposensitivity domains. So some examples I just wanted to give you. Hopefully some of you remember perhaps participating in this survey, but wanted to give you an example of some of the questions that were asked in the survey. So for example, from the tactile domain, the question may say, these tactile sensations bother the person in my life with, say, CP, and it could be someone answering for themselves, or again, a caregiver answering for a person with CP. And you see a list of various things that might bother someone: mud, lotion or sunblock, a coarse carpet, finger paint, glue, food, hair product. And for each of these, you would just respond yes or no. Okay. So that was how we collected the sensory data. We also asked questions about the functional scales, and we already talked about the gross motor functional classification scale. These are the other functional classification scales that we asked about. And here's an example of what the questions in the survey looked like to help determine this classification scale. So I'll just read what it says. It says, for the questions about function below, please choose the best possible response, knowing that you may have some uncertainty about choosing between 2 options. How does the person in your life with CP eat and drink? And then the options are eat and drink all textures and thicknesses safely and well, eat and drink all textures and thicknesses safely but slowly. And then it continues down to does not eat or drink safely, but may be able to do small tastes of food or drink. Okay, so that's an example of how we assessed the functional classifications. So what did we find? We found actually a remarkable number. The way the sensory scale is set up is such that any positive result means there's some sensory symptom that is bothersome. And so 97%, there are no controls here. There are no, every person who took this survey has cerebral palsy. So there were no kind of control people without CP in this study. And so 97% of the people who responded in this survey had at least one sensory symptom.
Danielle, can I interrupt with a quick question?
Please do.
I'm trying to make it interactive. You asked.
Yes, that's exactly what I asked for. I appreciate it.
Is there a study, has this measure ever been used in the general population, even though there's not a control, but to compare a CP-specific population to the population?
The population, that's an excellent question. And from what I recall, and maybe Dr. Aravamuthan wants to jump in, but from what I recall with our discussions with Dr. Lyons-Warren, who is the one who chose this scale, any measure is considered abnormal. And I don't know what the baseline should be. So that's a really good question.
Okay.
Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo what Dr. Barber said, the fact that the way the questions were worded was, does this bother you? The fact that it is associated with something that is bothersome is thought of as an abnormal finding. It's not, do you perceive this? It's, does it actually bother you? Does it hinder you in some way? It sounds like the SPSI folks and the sensory field at large is very reticent for various reasons to compare a typically developing, to define sensory symptoms in a typically developing population and compare it with other populations when not done in the same context. So it is, and Dr. Lyons-Warren has been similarly reticent. So what is the equivalent of 97% in people without CP,
right,
is hard to say.
Dr. Barber, I just wanted to ask you a question. It's David here.
Yeah.
You mentioned the person who set up the test was basically using a autistic model. I was wondering, were you also looking at possibly using a similar model with people with epilepsy?
Oh, good question. I am not sure. I would guess that this sensory scale has not been assessed in a community of, or in a registry of people with epilepsy. The people who develop this scale come from the autism field.
Right.
That's their background, but so I'm not sure. There is a lot of overlap between people with autism and people with epilepsy, but I don't know that this has been used in that field at all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a comment.
Please.
So as far as CP, no CP, everybody's on the sensory spectrum in some form or fashion. So I guess my comment is it would be hard to compare it, even if you were comparing something different, because we're all on the sensory spectrum. It's just that people with neuromotor disorders or people that are neurodivergent are maybe more sensitive or less sensitive on that spectrum. So they'd be on the ends of the bell curve versus the typically, in the middle.
That's
And
exactly.
So I mean, because if you think about it, like smoking is a form of regulation, and not everybody with CP smokes. Tapping a pencil, chewing gum, tapping your foot on the ground, that is all forms of sensory regulation activities that the whole population does. So I mean, I don't know if that would be the most important thing, to have to compare it to a non-CP group, I guess, since we're all on the sensory spectrum. It's just a matter of where that is.
Exactly. And I think you raise exactly, thank you so much for expressing it that way. That's exactly what we were trying to get at. That's exactly what we were looking at with this study, because we did not know when we started this, when we set up this survey and asked everyone in the MyCP registry to fill it out. We did not know, are we going to find out that people with CP have decreased sensation, hyposensitivity, in which domains, in tactile, or increased sensitivity in vision and hearing, and how does that change over time? So I'm going to get to some of the data slides and I'll show you what we found. And I'm very curious to hear what you think. Okay, so of those sensory symptoms, the most common response was in the tactile domain. And so you can see here 129 out of 155 responses, so about 83% of the folks who completed the survey had a tactile score that was greater than 0. Okay. And we also found that the total, and I'm going to kind of go through a summary here, and then I'll break it down and show you some graphs of how the data played out. So the total sensory score decreased with age, mostly from decreased total hyposensitivity score with age. So, and most of that was in the tactile domain. So younger kids had more hyposensitivity, so less sensitive, mostly in touch, and that improved with age. And across all functional domains, hypo and hypersensitivities increased with greater degrees of functional limitation. So let me show you, an age-specific decrease in hyposensitivity was most pronounced in people with the greatest gross motor functional impairment. So I'm going to show you this a little bit more broken down into graphs. So here, the take-home message from these graphs is that sensory symptoms are common in people with CP, okay? This is just a histogram, and you can see the y-axis, if we're just looking at the panel A here on the left, on the y-axis are number of people who responded in a certain way, and on the x-axis, it's showing you the total sensory score. So a normal in quotes score, or score of having no sensory symptoms that bother you on this scale, on this measure, would be a score of 0. And then a score of 1 would mean that you answered yes, every item on this test was bothersome. And this first bin actually includes not just the people who responded 0, but it also includes the people who answered yes to either 1 or 2 questions. And so you can see here that this is the numbers of people who responded with sensory score. So most people were not very high, but and the number of people who have higher scores goes down as the scores get higher. And this breaks down into different domains of sensation. Here's how it breaks down for tactile. So there were more people with higher scores here. Proprioception was also a big one. So hold on, sorry. Let me just, where did my mouse go? Okay. So while overall there were 5 people who reported no sensory symptoms in any area, almost all participants reported at least one sensory symptom, and 30 people, 19%, reported at least one sensory symptom in each sensory modality. So in touch, vision, auditory, taste, and olfaction. Okay. Then we're looking here at, so the previous slide was the total sensory scale altogether. Now we're looking at just the hypersensitivity score. So within each sensory domain, increased sensation. And here, 96% of participants, so 149 people out of the 155, noted at least one hypersensitivity symptom. And this distribution of scores was similar for the total sensory symptoms. And this was seen for each of the sensory modalities. And then, interestingly, hyposensitivity is a little bit less common than hypersensitivity. Here, 70% of people, 108 people out of 155, reported at least one hyposensitivity symptom, although there was still a wide distribution for each sensory modality. Okay, so we also know that hyper and hyposensitivity can coexist in the same person. And most participants, almost 70%, reported at least one sensory symptom for both hyper and hyposensitivity. Of the 48 people who did not report both hyper and hypo, 5 people reported no sensory symptoms, 42 people reported only hyper, and only 1 person reported only hyposensitivity symptoms. So again, most people have hyper and hyposensitivity sensory symptoms within the same person. It could be across different sensory domains. Okay, this is one that I think is really interesting, and we were talking with John just before the webinar started about how these things may change with age. So on this graph, you can see each dot is one person who responded to the study. On the x-axis, we have age, so the age of the person that filled out the survey. And then on the y-axis, we have the total sensory score. And when we look across 155 people, we see this relationship with age, that as people get older, their total sensory score falls. So there are less sensations that, and this is accumulated from all of the sensory modalities, less sensations are bothersome as people get older. We can also see that this is mostly driven by the hyposensitivity symptoms. So here on the left, we have the hyposensitivity, decreased sensitivity score across all of the sensory domains. And here on the right, we have the hypersensitivity score. And most of this angle, the slope here, as you can see, is stronger for the hyposensitivity score. So as people get older, there's more hyposensitivity in younger folks. And as people get older, that hyposensitivity decreases. So John, what you were mentioning earlier, your intuitive sense that with age, with time, we learn how to experience sensation more. That seems right on the money and consistent with the data that we found from this study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we wanted to look at how sensory responses change with, aside from sensory responses right now, we're looking at, within this cohort, functional ability related to age in this cohort. And in the folks who responded to the study, again, here we have, this is the gross motor function classification scale. So level 1 being folks who have the most mobility, and level 5 being the folks who have the least mobility, independent mobility. And here on the y-axis, we have age. So older being up toward the top and younger being down toward the bottom. You can see that of the dots, there are more gray dots in the younger age ranges in the gross motor function classification scale level 5 folks. So the participant characteristics were not evenly distributed. Younger kids tended to have a higher GMFCS level. And this also was similar for the other functional classification scales. So this is the MAX scale, which is looking at hand function, a communication scale of function. And again, we see that older folks are lower on this scale, which means less impaired. A vision scale, similar results. So again, as people get older, in this cohort, this is not saying that function improves over time. This is saying that of the people in this cohort, of the people who took this survey, the people who are older tend to be have milder symptoms than or improved function. Okay, and then now we're connecting the dots with comparing the results of the sensory results with those motor function levels. And here what we see is that this is again on the x-axis, we have the gross motor function classification scale from 1 to 5, and on the y-axis we have that hyposensitivity score. And what we see is the folks who are gross motor function level 5 had more hyposensitivity than folks in other gross motor function scales. So we know, actually, again, I mentioned that this sensory scale came from the autism community, and we know that in autism, sensory behaviors do correlate also with functional ability. And here we also see that the hyposensitivity score in our cohort was significantly higher in individuals who had gross motor function classification level 5 compared to the other functional categories. The other functional classification scales were also had similar results. So here it is for the manual score, communication, and vision. And so the degree of sensory behaviors is positively associated with a degree of functional impairment in multiple areas for functional ability. So
Danielle, could you
Please.
just comment on the bracketing that's at the top, just with the bracketing with the asterisks is
yeah. So here, this is the statistical comparisons of comparing each group to the level 5 group. You noted, Paul, that we don't have the same number of people who are gross motor function level 5 compared to, we have a lot of people who are gross motor function level 2 who took the survey, right? So it's not an even distribution. And the results also were not evenly distributed. And so we, you know, you can, oh, mouse is not moving. I don't know what happened.
No, it was moving for me at least.
Okay. You can really see this black bar here in the middle is showing the mean. You can really see that the mean looks quite similar across these groups, 1 through 4, but really looks different for folks in group 5. And so these bars at the top are the statistical comparisons of statistically comparing the results of people in group 4 to people in group 5 on this hyposensitivity score. And the asterisks mean that it's significant with a p-value less than, I don't know, 0.001.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that clear? I hope that's clear.
Yeah, to the degree that my statistics from my sophomore year in college in psychology can keep up with this, yeah, sure. That's sufficient for me.
Yeah, I think statistics is always interesting. So, but this is one of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. He said, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics, right? So you can play with statistics to make them say lots of different things. But in this case, I think you can even just ignore, I'm putting my hand over the screen as if you can see what I'm covering up. But even if you ignored these bars and you just looked at how these dots play out, just looking at the gray dots, I mean, this really looks different than these groups. Do you agree? I think it looks different to my eye.
Yeah, I was muted. I think it looks very different, and knowing that the comparison line is saying it's like a significant p-value says to me the statistics say that it's very significant, or it's reliably very significant.
Yeah, reliably very different from each other. These are clearly separate groups. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So again, because we really, on the previous slide, we really saw that the sensory score in folks with gross motor function level 5 is really different from those with all levels 1 through 4. We then looked at the sensory score as it changes with age, both in folks with gross motor function levels 1 through 4, and then separately in folks with gross motor function level 5. And in both groups, we see that with age, as people get older, as we move on this x-axis towards the right, the sensory score goes down. But that is especially dramatic in people with gross motor function level 5. Okay, so this trend was strongest again what I'm showing you here is the total sensory score, but again, this trend was strongest for hyposensitivity, but it was also true for hypersensitivity as well. And this was, so I'm showing you here. Here's hyposensitivity and here's hypersensitivity. And then on the right here, these are for folks with gross motor function level 5. So we really see that as people get older, those hyposensitivity symptoms really improve, or really are less. Okay. So what can we take from that? These findings suggest a reduction in sensory symptoms with age in people with CP, with a higher burden of sensory symptoms in people with greater functional impairments. It also demonstrates decreased hyposensitivity with age, especially in the tactile domain, and especially pronounced in people with the greatest gross motor functional limitations. So it's possible that decreased hyposensitivity might contribute to other age-related phenomena in people with cerebral palsy. And this is something that we're very curious about, and I know Dr. Aravamuthan has been probably wants to jump in and say something here. If you want to, feel free. Otherwise, I'm happy to.
I would be happy to. I think the interesting thing about all of to me, one of the most interesting things about the analyses that you presented so well, Dr. Barber, is the potential change in these symptoms over time, and I don't know if how clear it was to people viewing, but we struggled a lot with the data trying to figure out what was related to age and what was related to function. And so a lot of the comparisons we were making in the data were, are these changes in sensation reflective of function, of age, or of both? And I think, to me, kind of a takeaway from this is that it's probably both, but that there is an independent contributor, what we think is an independent contributor of age. So the older you get, even when looking within individual functional groups by GMFCS or other functional categories, we're seeing this trend. So that's the only other thing I would add to what you said.
Yeah. And We can talk about implications of this, but I want to just add that this is also something that I brought up before we started the webinar, but this is a cross-sectional cohort study. So we did not take one person and follow that person longitudinally over years, right? So we can't say, you know, Danielle sensory symptoms improved with age. We're looking at lots of different people and just taking snapshots in time. And so that's very different than saying for one individual, you know, your sensory function improved with age, right? So I think this is a great first study. This is certainly something new that we did not know about people with CP before this survey was done. But it certainly leads us to more questions that need to be addressed with future studies.
Great. Oh, did you have another?
Yeah.
Oh, more limitations. Keep going.
More people, we would love to have, you know, another limitation to this study was that there were fewer pediatric participants and fewer participants with higher GMFCS and other functional scale levels. And then the other thing is that everything here is a correlation, right? Nothing is causal. Everything is just looking at associations. So we have other thoughts. We're going to be presenting this work at the AACPDM meeting in the fall, and we are in the middle of preparing a manuscript. And then I will leave this slide up with our contact information for just a moment. And then I'd love to stop sharing and be able to see everyone's videos again. And then happy to talk and answer questions, and would love to have a conversation about what folks think about these data.
I think there was a question from either Poonam or Jay Pandey. I'm not sure who was which one of you it is behind the Pandey. So had their hand up, hand went down. Still interested in the question?
Yeah, this is Poonam.
Hi, Poonam.
So I think that the last slide sort of answered my question. I noted that the age, the change with age for GMFCS 5 kind of stopped at 40, whereas the other one goes all the way to 80. So I was wondering that maybe you just didn't get enough people at the higher age range for that population. Because I think it'll be interesting to see how it progresses. Because it is pretty steep going down to 40. So is it that with GMFCS 5, everything like kind of comes down and doesn't continue as long?
We're doing a lot to recruit people into the registry that are GMFCS 5 over the next year. So hopefully, you could always consider rerunning this since it's easy to turn on and whatnot if you want to see if your data changes. But there's still going to be limitations of selection bias and whatnot. But
yeah, I think you interpreted it perfectly. You're great at reading these graphs, so I'm glad that was clear. There is a floor here, right? So 0 is the floor of not having sensory symptoms, right? And so it's not going to go below that because the scale doesn't go below that. But yeah, it is very interesting to see those to see that relationship. What do folks think about it? Does it seem consistent with your experience, with what you'd expect, or is it surprising to anyone?
Let me manage that by letting David ask his question, but by first responding to that. So David, can you address Dr. Barber's question and then ask your question? And I'll do the same with Manal.
Okay. First of all, I want to say I'm 39 plus. Second of all, I found in my own experience, I have seen an increase in sensory in both hearing and touch. I cannot speak for the other areas. But I have noticed as I have gotten older, I have seen for myself personally, again, hearing and touch. What I mean by touch, for example, I mean, for some reason, I'm one of those people that just can't wear jewelry. It just bothers my skin. So I've just stopped wearing jewelry.
Interesting. Did you have another thing that you wanted to ask as well, since I sort of forced you down the path of answering
Yeah,
Dr.
you
Barber's question?
actually forced me down a different path, Paul.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Actually, if I will pass on that for now, Paul. If I remember the question, I will send you a mail note.
Okay.
Please, or you can ask again.
The next person, I'm probably will pronounce your name wrong, but Manal.
Yes, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a clinician, so I was just wondering if, because we know about sensory processing and sensory adaptation. So how do you think you can ferret out the decrease or the changes in sensory processing over time? That, I mean, how would you? Don't we expect that adaptation is going to impact any of us as time goes on? We get exposed to more things, and then we don't get as sensitive to those things, or more sensitive.
Do you want me to? Yeah. Okay. So, hi. So, I think that's a great question. I think that, maybe for some context, I know we talked about the difficulty in comparing between groups with sensory processing. But to your point, in the groups in which sensory processing has been studied with this scale or with comparable scales, they do see, particularly in populations that tend to have more sensory symptoms, that those symptoms do tend to improve over time. That the older you get, those sensory symptoms improve. That is a common finding in other populations of people that have been studied. What I think is particularly interesting here is what seems to be a differential in the kind of symptoms that are improving, and how that does seem to improve with age, and that also it seems to improve the most in people that have the greatest functional limitations, particularly gross functional limitations. So with all the caveats that Danielle laid out, it looks like people that have at GMFCS level 5, so people that have what we would consider to be the greatest gross motor functional impairments, have the greatest improvement, or on this scale, the greatest reduction in their sensory symptoms over time. And then when we look at the type of sensory symptoms, yes, if you look at the overall score, it is an improvement in the overall score, but that is driven by an improvement in hyposensitivity. So they become more sensitive to things over time. And that's most pronounced in the people with the greatest functional limitations. So I'm thinking about what that means really. And one hypothesis that we're discussing is what can this mean in terms of pain and rates of pain that we're seeing in people with CP, and how that seems, there's some thought that pain is increasing as you get older. And there are the typical things that we think about, well, you know, musculoskeletal wear and tear, you're losing, sadly, often therapy services the older you get, and those sorts of things contribute to pain. But what if this progression, what if a progression in sensory loss of hyposensitivity is also making you more susceptible to perceiving pain as you get older? Now, these are all hypotheses I'm throwing out there. I'm not saying that we have the data to back this up. These are just the hypotheses that we are starting to generate based on this data. with the caveats that you laid out. We know that overall sensory symptoms across the board tend to improve with age, but it's in these specific groups that we think the questions start multiplying.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I know we're right at the hour's edge. If Dr. Barber, I know you're on the East Coast, as are others, but if you're up for it, I will take one last question since Amber had her hand up for a while. If you're not, I totally understand.
Yeah, I just had a comment. I haven't seen the sensitivities improve per se with the kids that I've worked with. What I see is it is based on, you know, stress levels and different things in the environment. So it will be better for a while based on environmental changes, emotional changes, physical changes, and then you know it'll come back, kind of like reflexes. We all use reflexes in emergency situations. So you know, an ATNR is like when you're driving, you know. So I just like you kind of see that come back. So I just wanted to make that comment because I haven't necessarily see it get better in the children I've worked with and in some adults too. It's just that I think it's like the nervous system's adaptive, and depending on what's going on, then you see it more, sometimes less other times. And the other sensory system I would be interested in you looking at is the interoception. If you haven't
Those
looked at,
internal sensations, yeah.
yes.
Very, very interesting. You know, I think this is a part of the limitations of this study is we could not look at one person over time, right? And so this is, I think, where Paul, as you suggested, maybe we do ask the same folks who took this survey last year to take it again. Maybe spend 15 or 20 minutes once a year taking the survey over several years, and then we can collect some data on how does this change over time for an individual. It would be very interesting.
I think
that's a pretty minor change for us to make in the registry. So we just need to, you know, given the sort of underpinnings, we just be able to add it as events. So if you think that would be a useful study, we should probably go through an approval process for that and amend do an IRB amendment for the community registry and just set that up. That would be pretty easy to do. Did you have a final comment, Amber? Because I do want to wrap up.
Yeah, just that I think it's great that the sensory aspect of CP is finally being looked at, because it is a sensory motor disorder, but it tends to, people only look at it as a neuromotor disorder and only look at motor function. And I mean, I can attest to that as when I was little. And so I'm very excited professionally and personally that this is finally getting on the map. I think this is a great first steps, and I think we have, you know, there's a lot of area. I think there's a lot of other pieces that are maybe specific to CP as well that we just haven't uncovered yet, but I'm sure we will. And so I just want to acknowledge that as well.
Well, thank you. I couldn't think of a better way to sort of serve up my appreciations to Dr. Boom, Dr. Barber. Thank you so much for spending the time to understand this area, using our infrastructure to do that and to present these findings to our community. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening. I'll post a recording after I fix the beginning of it, but thank you all very much. Good evening.
Thank you.